I am Paula Meyer, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion on director compensation trends. Pearl Meyer and NACD recently published the 26th annual Pearl Meyer NACD Director Compensation Report, a detailed look at the most recent data on public company board pay. This report is particularly helpful given the increasing responsibilities, time commitment, and scrutiny we face as directors. With me today are the authors of the report, Ryan Howrahan and his colleague Tim Dupuy, both experts in director compensation. We are looking forward to a robust discussion. Before we begin, Mary Canizales with NACD has some housekeeping items to cover.
Thank you so much, Paula, and welcome everyone. It's that time of year where Pearl Meyer and NACD put together this amazing report, and we brought together a presentation for you to discuss the findings, and I'm sure what that's going to do is it's going to drive a lot of questions among you. So with that in mind, please remember to use the Q&A box to submit your questions, and if you want, you can also use the chat to chat amongst each other. But save those questions for the Q&A box. We have saved a little bit of time at the end to answer some of those questions, but in case we can't get to your question, we will share your email information with the experts at Pearl Meyer so that they can respond to you via email in the next couple of days. The number one question we always get is whether or not this presentation is available. If you look under the resources tab, you'll see that it's already there. And of course, the webinar recording will be available online afterwards. The link will also be available in the event email that follows this webinar. So as always, keep an eye out for this webinar next week, both on nacdonline.org webinars, in our archives, and on pearlmeyer.com. In the next slide, I just want to remind those of you who are certified directors that your participation in today's live webinar earns you 1 credit towards maintaining that certification. You'll automatically receive that credit for your participation, but note you must attend the webinar for at least 50 minutes to receive that credit. And speaking of that director certification program, if you're interested in standing out amongst other directors and showing your boards that you are really interested in staying on top of trends and learning about governance, and you're not part of the program, make sure to reach out to a member advisor at credentialing@nacdonline.org. Finally, we have a few evaluation questions that we ask you at the end of the webinar. Please take time to fill this out. It really only helps us to make these webinars a little bit better for you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our experts, that's the real point of why you're here today. So Ryan, why don't you get us started?
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. Paula, we're certainly thrilled to have you in attendance as well and being able to provide some kind of real-life insights to support some of this NACD director compensation data that we have worked hard to cull together. For those of you who aren't familiar with the NACD report, essentially, this is something NACD does in tandem with Pearl Meyer on an annual basis. We look across 1,400 publicly traded firms spanning 24 different industries to provide the latest data on cash and equity compensation, along with a number of important governance policies and practices. As Paula alluded to, this webinar is really going to be focused on the recently published NACD report. We will share some high-level data on board pay, historical analysis, provide some insights on evolving trends. We'll also discuss some of the pros and cons of compensation for special committees, which is becoming a more frequent occurrence, as Paula alluded to, just given the expanded purview of board service. And for the learning objectives today, we're really hoping everyone leaves the session with a general understanding of current director pay levels and structures for public companies at multiple revenue bands, an understanding of leading practices for board compensation policies and equity grant programs, and just gain insights in terms of the evolution of director comp that we've seen over the last several years. Next slide, please. Before we jump into kind of the statistical data of the report, we always just kind of like to set the stage in terms of what the environment in the boardroom currently looks like. Some of this, for those who have attended webinars or these webinars in the past, are areas that we have covered somewhat historically, but continue to gain traction. Certainly in recent years, digital innovation and increased workforce dynamics have begun to transform the strategic priorities for many companies. As a result, the responsibilities and talent needs for board of directors has evolved tremendously. Boards are now facing heightened expectations to oversee digital transformation, largely in that AI space. I know a lot of you have probably in addition, companies are kind of grappling with this return to office. Workforce strategy has landed itself in a regular spot on the board agenda, along with the already prominent ESG, DEI related requirements, which, given some of the rhetoric in politics these days, we're already seeing some, pushback on some of that DEI related activity. In addition, as a result, I should say, of some of these evolving needs and focuses at the board level, I certainly think we're starting to see a greater emphasis on board refreshment, on ensuring that we have the right talent set at the board to ensure that we can provide shareholders comfort that we are not only capable, but we are actively addressing kind of these new areas of expectations. And I think finally, the kind of part that's still a little bit gray is how the upcoming, or the current administration, I should say, may influence economic and geopolitical environments and what regulatory changes may occur as a result of that. As I said, I think we're already starting to see a little bit of that on the ESG, DEI space in terms of some pushback in those areas. And we'll get a little bit more into detail on that when we look at kind of gender diversity, retirement ages, those kind of things at the board level. So that is kind of, it shouldn't be a major surprise to anyone on this call, but those are some of the prevalent themes we are seeing emerge in the boardrooms over the last year or so. Next slide. So a question for everybody on the meeting today, on the call: which of the following emerging priorities do you think will have the greatest impact on board governance in the coming years? Digital transformation and cybersecurity oversight, workforce strategy and return to office dynamics, regulatory compliance, other. And Paula, I might just pause while the others are providing their answers and say, from your perspective, on your boards, what do you believe to be kind of if you were going to kind of rank order these, or if you can rank order these, what do you think is going to be kind of the greatest impact on board governance in the upcoming years?
I think digital transformation and cybersecurity oversight would certainly be a higher priority than the other two. Both of the current boards that I serve on have grappled with workforce strategy and settled in a good place for them. Certainly regulatory, I'm in the financial services industry, and so regulatory is always an issue, but no greater an issue now than in the past.
Yeah, and if you look, I think that, your response, Paula, tends to align with what we've heard from the broader group, and that digital transformation, cybersecurity, 70%, regulatory compliance, second with 14%, workforce strategy, return to office dynamics at 12%. We're starting to hear a little bit more on that workforce strategy and return to office dynamic over the last couple of weeks in the news cycle. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that one start ticking up a little bit over the next couple months, year or so. But certainly, I'm not surprised at all to see digital transformation and cybersecurity oversight be the top of this list. It's certainly the number one priority from a governance perspective in terms of evolution amongst most of my clients.
Yeah, I have a similar experience, Ryan. I would say almost all the boards that I'm working with, are talking about the digital transformation and cybersecurity. I think depending on the industry, and highly regulated industries see the regulatory compliance is certainly being discussed, but not to the extent of A.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, please. So this is just, again, a breakdown for those that aren't completely familiar with the NACD report. We bifurcate the data into 5 data cuts, starting with a micro. You can see the revenue size ranges associated with those data cuts to the right. As I said, we're looking across 1,400 companies. We tried to keep the size categories relatively consistently sized. But essentially, this is the breakdown of kind of the 5 cuts of data and how we will represent those over the course of this presentation today. Next slide. So this slide is an interesting look at kind of total direct compensation changes year to year amongst the director constituents. And again, this is just a board member, so this doesn't account for lead or committee lead type of incremental. This would just be the annual cash, annual equity retainer at these levels. But one of the interesting things, and not a huge surprise, again, in terms of the all firm number, we're seeing, low single digit year over year growth. I think the interesting takeaway from this chart is if you look at the small and micro cuts, you are seeing larger year to year jumps in those areas. And I think some of that is driven by the fact that given the enhanced scrutiny, the enhanced access to news cycles and everything else, micro companies and small companies are realizing we need to have a governance profile that is as strong as these medium and large size organizations. And in order to get the type of directors we need with that level of skill set and that focus, we probably need to start closing that gap in pay. So you can see, again, most pronounced in the micro. Does not surprise me. I would anticipate this going forward. Again, the level of scrutiny across all of these levels, all of those things we alluded to, cybersecurity is not just a focus at top 200. It is bleeding into all size categories. And I think as a result of that, you are starting to see larger increases at some of these smaller and micro-sized companies. And I think what it will ultimately result in is the dichotomy between micro to large will not be quite as pronounced as it has been historically. And I think that's just largely driven by the expectations associated with micro and small board membership has continued to increase. And now, the governance profile doesn't look much different than it would in a medium or large size organization. Next slide, please. This is a slide that I do want to spend a little bit of time on, and we alluded to this kind of at the onset when we spoke about environment, is this idea around board refreshment. If you can kind of pull your eyes to the middle of the screen where we see mandatory retirement ages, we have seen the prevalence of disclosure on these continue to creep up every year. In the interest of, if I have a mandatory retirement age, it provides an easier path potentially to director turnover to some extent. I also think the median director age number, you're going to start to see this number. It has historically been in the low to mid 60s. I think you're going to start seeing this number climb down a little bit. And the rationale behind that is going to be, again, largely driven by this cybersecurity, digital innovation, just the age groups that have the most experience and understanding of those categories tend to be a demographic that's slightly younger than that 65. So I think you're going to find additional companies probably leaning into a younger director base in the interest of making sure they have the skill sets that are needed to kind of address all of these new topics at the board level. Another area I want to point us to is the bottom of this slide, the gender diversity. Certainly over the last several years, we have seen a tremendous uptick in gender diversity. In fact, you can see amongst medium and large, we had a greater than 10% jump in companies with 3 or more female directors. Certainly something we think has been a value add for companies is this increased push for diversity. That said, there has been pushback on DEI initiatives fairly substantially in terms of obviously rhetoric coming out of political office and those kind of things. In fact, last week, ISS has come out and said we will no longer be evaluating gender or ethnic diversity when we are making director voting recommendations. So while I think this is a very important slide and something that we're still pushing for at Pearl Meyer, I will be interested to see how these gender diversity numbers look going forward, if we still see the same significant year-over-year jumps, given some of the step back from some of the larger proxy advisory firms and even institutional investors and how they evaluate some of these things. Obviously, ethnic diversity is not shown on here because it's just not something that's easily gleaned from the filings, but you can expect if ethnic diversity was on here, you would see a similar uptick to what you've seen in gender diversity. But again, I think the question remains to say, how does that look 2 to 3 years from now with some of this this pushback from a DEI perspective. Next slide, please. So this takes us to our second polling question. And Paula, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this once I read it to the group. But in light of the evolving political and regulatory landscape, how do you anticipate your board's focus on ESG, particularly DEI? I would say initiatives will change as it relates to director diversity, an increased focus, investment in ESG, DEI, maintain current focus, decrease focus, or reassess priorities to align with emerging stakeholder expectations, or we're just unsure at this point in time. Paula, ask your opinion on what you're seeing amongst your boards.
I serve on 2 corporate boards, and both have reiterated their intention to maintain their current focus and approach, because both the board in both cases and the senior leader teams have benefited by improved diversity of thought. So I don't anticipate significant change on my boards.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard a mixed bag and amongst my clients, and when I look at the polling question, about half are aligned with Paula in terms of, kind of maintain current focus. I don't think at this point anyone is leaning further in, or not many people are leaning further in until we get more clarity on kind of what the outcomes of some of this pushback will be. But it's a pretty mixed bag between maintain current focus, decrease focus, or just reassess. And I think, as I said, as I look across my client base, that's fairly reflective of what I'm seeing. It's a very cultural kind of decision. A lot of the companies that had a bit, that are maintaining current focus and approach were companies that had kind of ESG, DEI culturally embedded even before some of that became, prominent rhetoric. So, again, I think some of it comes down to culture, but I am not at all surprised to see kind of a mix in terms of response for companies that are going to be, reevaluating or even maybe stepping back a bit to companies that are just going to kind of maintain status quo. As I said, I think in the boardrooms that I've been privy to, and Tim, I'll ask you the same question, but diverse opinions, this push to diversity has, from my perspective, increased and enhanced the conversation at the board level, because it's brought a variety of perspectives, which I always think enhances that conversation. So I think, we're kind of in the camp of 2 potentially at this point in time, but maybe moving into 4 as more rhetoric comes out on this. But Tim, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think my experience is pretty similar to yours, Ryan. I would say most of the boards I'm working with are, maintaining the current focus and approach. I certainly don't have any organizations at this point that are increasing their focus. Those that are maintaining tend to be organizations that are heavily involved within their own communities. But I would say, those that maybe are not so involved in their communities are more number 4, kind of reassessing, having discussions on how they want to kind of handle this moving forward.
Yeah, very similar. All right, fantastic. Next slide, please. So now we're looking at all firms. So the size categories that I showed you at the beginning of the conversation, we've now kind of mashed into all one data point. And really what this slide is showing you is, from a cash retainer perspective, largely consistent year to year. We haven't seen much dichotomy in terms of that. Committee compensation also relatively static. We're certainly seeing a decrease, and this has been a common theme over the last several years, in terms of board meeting fees. I think there's just been a push to simplify director compensation. I have been part of clients where you get on a board call for 15 minutes and people are saying, well, does this justify a meeting? And then, also meeting fees can lead to lumpy kind of year-to-year compensation. So not a phenomena that I expect to go away. I think board meeting fees are largely falling away for the most part. Those are largely being picked up in the annual cash retainer. The other aspect, I think, from just in terms of simplification, we'll talk a little bit about this later, is just in terms of incremental committee membership compensation. You're still seeing a lot of incremental committee lead compensation. I think you're starting to see the prevalence of incremental committee member compensation start to dissipate a bit. It's still prevalent practice, but I think companies are realizing that if I have different pay levels across committees for membership, it becomes more difficult to have mobility amongst my board, meaning if I move somebody from audit to nominating and governance, it can be viewed as a deduction in compensation. And is that really the way we want to get at this? I also think the other key takeaways that you're looking at here is equity. There's just a greater focus on equity. I don't think anyone's surprised by that, but we've certainly seen companies lean more heavily into the equity piece in terms of areas where they're increasing compensation. And the rationale behind that is just the feeling that, you know, the greater we lean into equity, the greater alignment we've created with shareholders, and at the board level, that obviously is an important component. So I think the key takeaways here are certainly from a cash perspective, largely static with some minor upticks year to year, certainly a significant decrease in the prevalence of meeting fees, and a greater focus on equity compensation as a mix in terms of total compensation. Next slide. This is just a graphic representation across the various size cuts in terms of how the total compensation is delivered. And then the coloring of the bar charts is ultimately how those awards are or how that compensation is bifurcated between cash and equity awards. If you look across all size categories, the majority of compensation is delivered in full value stock. So generally time-based restricted stock, with the annual cash retainer generally being the second most utilized component. Stock options, again, not utilized heavily, more heavily utilized at the micro size cut. And the rationale behind stock options at that size cut is it's just sometimes hard from a dilution perspective to provide full value shares on a value delineated basis, because I have to deliver, if my share price is low, I have to deliver so many of them to provide reasonable value. So some companies will either use a fixed value approach, or a fixed share approach, or just utilize options for the fact that they have potentially a bit more upside built in. But as I said, you're certainly seeing the pay mix and the weighting that's ascribed to equity in terms of that build up to 100% grow. In fact, amongst the top 200, it's almost 60% of the total pot. I would anticipate when we see this next year, this number will probably be north 60% or north. So again, a trend that I continue to see, fleshing itself out over the next several years, and not something that I anticipate stopping anytime soon. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim to read the poll question, and then Paula, certainly chime in with your response as we wait for others to kind of give their feedback, please.
Yeah, so as we think about pay mix, we're curious how all of your board's pay mix have evolved over the past several years. One, are you moving away from variable pay elements such as meeting fees and committee member retainers, and more towards the fixed elements of the director compensation program, being the annual cash and equity retainers? Two, are you doing the opposite? Have you moved away from some of the fixed pay elements, annual cash and equity retainers, and have actually installed meeting fees and committee member compensation? Or three, has the pay mix largely remained the same over the last few years? Paula, interested, what you're seeing among your boards. The boards that I work with, I would say I'd be surprised if a lot of companies are moving towards number two.
Yes, the boards that I've served on have all, over the last decade, moved towards simplification, away from meeting fees, away from committee fees, toward a retainer and an equity component, and the expectation that directors are there to do their job. And if it requires a few extra calls or some extra time studying a report or visiting some sales offices, that's what we do.
Yeah, my experience is the same, and it looks like the majority of the people on this call have a similar experience. We have 64% that has remained the same, which I suspect means that they have moved towards the fixed elements a while ago and have kind of stayed the course. And then 32% are actually have made that change of moving towards fixed pay over variable pay over the last few years. Only 4%, as we see, have selected option 2, which is not surprising to me.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from that 4% on the rationale for why. Is it special committee? I mean, is it what is the rationale for driving kind of more nuanced variable comp? I mean, and there certainly could be strong rationale. I don't necessarily know it off. So I'd be interested for that 4%, those 13 respondents, if you could provide some insight in terms of why that's the path you've taken, that would be helpful from my perspective. But anyway, go ahead, Tim.
Agree. Next slide. So just staying on the topic of pay mix, and this has been an NACD best practice for, gosh, I don't know, the last probably 10 years at least, of providing more than 50% of director compensation in the form of equity. We can see, basically every year, since 2022, the prevalence of organizations kind of meeting this criteria has increased. The prevalence of companies delivering more than 50% of TDC in equity increases by the size of the organizations. So we see, if we look at the top 200, that red bar, 95% of top 200 companies are delivering more than 50% of their director compensation in the form of equity. Most often it's restricted stock, but we're at a point now where 84% of all of the 1,400 companies within our study are providing this practice. Next slide. So as we think about how companies deliver the equity, the vast majority of companies deliver the equity as a fixed value. So, they will state in their proxy statement that, our directors receive $100,000 in stock. A smaller number of companies will define the equity that's being granted in the form of a fixed number of shares. So they might say that we provide all of our directors with $50,000 worth of shares. Companies tend to lean towards the fixed value approach because it provides a consistent compensation for the directors. Those companies that use the fixed share approach, their director compensation levels can be pretty volatile year over year, depending on how their stock price moves. And so that's why we see, a pretty small number of organizations, only 6% using that approach.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of the micro having a heavier prevalence on fixed share on that last slide, it's largely driven, as I alluded to earlier, it's a stock price phenomenon, yep. Meaning if I try to deliver fixed value and I'm trading at $1.50 a share, to try to provide competitive dollar value would be so dilutive to the stock that you can't really do it that way. So then you kind of air back to a fixed value, but that's obviously why as you look, as you move up the hierarchy here, you generally see that prevalence of fixed share approach kind of fall off a cliff as you get to that large kind of company size, because it's not a risk generally at those levels. And to Tim's point, the fixed value approach just becomes much more consistent in terms of year over year compensation rather than a fixed share approach, which can kind of bounce you year to year depending on where the stock is trading at that point in time.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, Ryan, it's a really good point. If I think about the micro companies, I think, a good number of those micro companies are probably in the tech space, and, having a fixed share approach allows, those directors to even be more aligned with some of the other shareholders, anticipating, kind of increased stock price appreciation in the short term. Next slide. So one of the other NACD best practices is to have stock ownership guidelines. We can now see that 82% of companies have stock ownership guidelines, slightly above prior year, which was at 80%. These guidelines are certainly more prevalent among the larger companies. So we see, only 55% of micro companies have stock ownership guidelines, while 81% of the top 200 companies have the stock ownership guidelines. The majority of these companies will define their ownership guideline as a multiple of their annual cash retainer. So 72% of companies define it that way. A smaller number of companies will either set an actual number of shares that directors are required to own, or they'll set it as a dollar value that isn't necessarily related to the annual cash retainer. If we move to the bottom, actually I'll stay on the top part. The median multiple that companies require directors to own is 5 times the annual cash retainer, really for all size companies outside of the micro companies where we see a 4 times retainer. And then in terms of the time frame that companies allow directors to meet their ownership requirement, it's 5 years really across the board. Moving to the bottom part of the table, it is becoming increasingly more prevalent to also have holding requirements, which means that directors are unable to sell their shares until, more often than not, until those ownership guidelines are achieved. So we can see that, almost 60% of companies across all of the organizations within the data set require their directors to hold their stock until the ownership guideline is received. A smaller number of companies, roughly about a quarter, require directors to hold their shares until retirement. What is interesting here, and Ryan, I'd be interested in your thoughts, among the top 200, the holding requirement of until retirement or until the guideline is achieved is about equal in prevalency, but that's not the case among all the other size groups.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think certainly when you move into that top 200, I think the expectation, certainly the ownership until or beyond retirement, I think is just by virtue of who generally sits on those boards, and that the fact that most of the net worths of those individuals on that board are not requiring compensation associated with director comp. So I'm not surprised by that at all. I think until ownership guideline achieved would be the most prevalent practice, I would assume, across all of our other size categories, which doesn't surprise me either. So, again, I see this data. It doesn't shock me tremendously. I think you're going to see percent holding requirements continue to uptick, because I think the perspective on it is it's just good governance to have holding requirements. And I think you're going to see more companies lean into beyond retirement, especially as you start seeing the level of pay dichotomy start maybe minimizing a bit between these size categories. But Paula, I'd be interested, is this generally reflective of what, in terms of stock ownership guidelines being a multiple of the cash retainer dollar, and, this idea of a holding requirement, is it something that you see kind of prevalently used amongst the boards you sit on?
Yes, with the exception that in one of my companies, you are allowed to sell stock to the extent you need to sell it to pay tax on the grant. But in that same company, we are required to hold the stock that we own until we retire from the board.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Ryan, I agree. I think, when we look at this data next year, we're going to see even a bigger uptick. I mean, if I look at those green highlighted cells on the holding requirement, we're already seeing, a larger than 5% increase among the small, large, and top 200 companies.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to go through these next couple slides quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. What we're showing here is the additional compensation that is paid to those directors that chair one of the committees on the board. This is a highly prevalent practice, and we've seen this trend for many years. Typically, the chair of the audit committee receives the most additional compensation, followed by the chair of the compensation committee, followed by the chair of the nominating governance committee. I will say, and Ryan and Paul, will be interested in your feedback. I would say among the larger organizations I work with, the gap between the additional compensation for the audit committee chair and the compensation committee chair is closing. The data reflects that there's still a meaningful difference, but interested in your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's certainly a phenomenon I've seen. I think the dichotomy between audit, comp, and gov have all started to blur a bit, depending on where things sit. I mean, DEI, human capital management, sometimes sits at comp, sometimes sits in nom and gov. I think you're going to still see audit being higher than the other, but I think you're going to your point, Tim, you're going to see nom and gov continue to kind of coalesce around one another. And I think you're going to see the dichotomy between audit and the other committees dissipate a bit, given the fact that the agendas across all of these committees, and I could argue the agenda across comp and gov has grown more significantly than audit over the last couple of years. Not to say that audit still isn't the heavy lift, but in terms of additional responsibilities over the last several years, I think comp and gov are certainly at the higher end of that, which is driving, I think, some of that, drop in differential from my perspective.
Yeah.
Agree.
I chair what we now call the talent committee on one of my company boards, and that name change reflects the broadening scope of the committee, and the gap between the chair pay for that company and the audit committee chair has narrowed. I also would argue that NomGov, especially when you're engaged in a director search, is a very significant time commitment, and board refreshment and ensuring that we have great candidates is a big project.
Yep. Definitely. If we go to the next slide, we'll just quickly cover committee member pay. So this would be additional compensation provided to those directors that serve on the different committees. A similar trend here outside of the large organizations. Typically, members of the audit committee receive more additional compensation than members of the comp committee and members of the NomGov. I will say that the prevalency of providing this additional committee retainers is declining. And you can even see within the top 200 companies, it's a minority practice to provide additional compensation. And this kind of alludes back to the discussion we had about pay mix as, companies are increasingly moving towards more fixed compensation rather than variable compensation. So, they're removing committee member compensation and kind of replacing that with additional cash retainers and equity retainers.
Yeah, I also think this speaks to committee mobility. I mean, as I said, to be able to move people seamlessly around committee from audit to comp to nom without them feeling like they're taking a compensation haircut becomes a tremendously easier conversation generally. I also think top 200 is an indicator of where all of these other levels are headed. So, even the large category, if you look, 52%, 50% on comp and nom, I could see those potentially being below 50% by the time we do this presentation next year. So again, I think this just speaks to simplification of compensation. I think this speaks to committee mobility. And it's not to say this compensation is falling out of director compensation. It's just moving into the annual cash and the annual equity bucket rather than being distinguished between, okay, you're a member of this, this, and this. And, God forbid you have a person that sits on all three committees, and are they paid, too much now because other people are only sitting on one committee? So it just takes a lot of noise to me out of the compensation program, getting rid of this. I still think incremental chair compensation is not going anywhere, because I just think the scrutiny, the liability, the extra work associated with that work warrants additional compensation. I do think this is something, though, from a member perspective, we're going to continue to see coming to fruition over the next couple of years.
Agree. So that leads us into our next polling question. Given the expanding responsibilities and oversight of the board, if we think about AI, cybersecurity, et cetera, how is your board currently approaching its committee structure? Have you recently established new committees to address these emergent areas? Are you in the evaluation process and discussing the need for additional committees? Are your existing committees effectively overseeing all areas and expanding the scope of the current committees as needed? Or are the existing committee structure effectively overseeing all areas without the need for changes? So Paula, curious on your thoughts here with your experience.
I actually serve on one board that did take the step of adding a couple of committees, and then after about 7 or 8 years, we decided to recombine those to just simplify the committee structure. And my other board it sticks with the traditional audit, comp, and as new topics arise, we either add that to the scope of one of those three committees or put it in the annual rotation of topics the full board is going to discuss.
Yeah, my experience, I would say, is pretty similar, and most fall within, option number 3, kind of sticking with the 3 main committees and adding additional responsibilities and oversight as needed. Ryan Pearson, your experience?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that is exactly, I'm not surprised by the response, and I think my experience echoes yours, Tim's.
Yeah, so it looks like from the respondents, 48% fall within option number 3 here, kind of sticking with the current committee and adding responsibilities. 22% sounds like a lot of the boards are in discussions of whether they have the need to add additional committees. So I'm not really surprised by these results at all.
Yeah, agreed. Certainly this speaks to just making sure your charters are up to snuff too. So everyone that's putting different things, just make sure you do a quick audit on the charters to make sure they speak to the additional areas of responsibility.
So as we move into board leadership, we're showing the different additional compensation that is provided to those boards that have a chair that is not an executive of the organization versus those that have a lead director where the CEO is likely the chair of the board. Non-executive chairs typically get compensated more than lead directors. We, in the middle set of columns there, the range of additional compensation tends to go from about 1.3 times a typical director cash retainer to, 1.6 times the typical cash retainer, in a top 200 company, whereas the lead director is, ranges from about, 1.12 times to 1.15 times. So a little narrower distribution there. And this just really reflects the idea that when you do have a non-executive chair, that is significantly a larger time commitment and more oversight than just having a lead director where the CEO is the chair of the board. And then Ryan, I'll turn it over to you for the closing thoughts on slide 22.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, all of this talks to the key themes that Tim and I and Paula have mentioned throughout the conversation today. But in terms of how board compensation structures are evolving, companies are adopting more stable compensation practices that align with governance standards and shareholder expectations. So again, getting rid of meeting fees, the variable pay elements, stock options becoming less common. Director pay shifting towards kind of that 60% equity, 40% cash mix, reducing reliance on cash compensation. Again, I don't anticipate that going. Cash compensation is not going away. Don't be afraid of that. But I think you're going to see companies continue to lean in equity in the interest of aligning board compensation with shareholders to the extent possible. And then in terms of leadership and responsibility changing, again, strong emphasis on board refreshment to enhance effectiveness. You can't accentuate enough to kind of step back and evaluate your board constituents and say, do we have the skill sets that we need to effectively execute strategically on all of these new areas of focus? I think, this idea of specialized committees, we've seen somewhat of a decrease in specialized committees as board and primary committees' responsibilities continue to expand. Kind of this idea of, I already have a comp committee of competent people. Why do I need to go out and establish a new committee? Maybe I'll pay them a little bit more to acknowledge a point in time where the workload ticks up a bit. But I think we're starting to see some pushback to say, is that special? Outside of things that are special committee needed, if you have a C-suite member that's committed fraud, that would require a special type of committee. But there are instances potentially, CEO search, for instance. I've heard a lot of companies that will say we have our own CEO search committee. I've seen a lot of companies that say, you know what, that's really the nominating and governance committee's job to assist with that. So why would we establish another committee? So food for thought, but those are, kind of the consistent themes, as I say, and the key takeaways from the conversation today. And again, really appreciate the feedback, the proactive responses to the polling questions. I know we have a number of Q&A questions that I can see popped up. Jessica, I don't know if we want to walk through those, or Paula, how we like to do.
I'll get us started on the questions from people who are participating in the webinar. First, recognizing that your report is a survey of public companies, can you make any broad statements about private company director pay?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely. I'll chime in, Tim, and then you can chime in. The thing about director compensation for privately held companies is it can come in many different shapes and sizes depending on the evolution of that privately held company. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if I have a very established, mature privately held company, you're going to see board of director compensation programs that are very similar to what you see in a publicly traded organization. I also work with a lot of very early stage startup type of private companies where a traditional board comp structure is not going to work. It tends to be heavy on the equity side. It tends to be heavily at risk. It might even be in the form of stock options, not full value shares. And you might not even see any cash compensation in some of those early stage companies. So it really runs the spectrum. Now, pay magnitude tends to drop a little bit in terms of looking at similarly sized public versus private, just given the scrutiny and some of the, the liability. But in my experience, that's generally what I saw. Tim, what about yourself?
Yeah, I'm probably, given my portfolio of clients, I would say more towards your first comment, where the compensation programs are structured more like publicly traded companies. From a magnitude level, what I would say my private companies that I work with, they're more focused on the cash compensation elements of the public companies. So depending on the size range, if they fall in that large size bucket, we'll likely do an analysis to focus on the cash compensation and kind of exclude the equity portion.
Yeah.
Certainly lower levels.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree, it's a mixed bag. And as I said, the early stage companies are going to be less inclined to lean heavily into cash, right? Just because cash is scarce. So as you become more mature, I agree, the cash. Now, I do have mature private companies that also have an equity provision in there too, but I agree with you, cash tends to be kind of the area that they look at as they get a bit more mature.
So we have another question here. A company is committed to their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Do you anticipate disclosures are likely to change?
I mean, a lot of companies have tried to kind of, I'll say, grandstand their ESG and DEI initiatives, Paula, just to say, look, our company really cares and is concerned about it. I think you might see a little bit of that rhetoric fall away in terms of just being so upfront with it. That said, I still think, as I said earlier, it's a very cultural decision. If it's something that's embedded into your company culture, I still think it's something that I would accentuate. I mean, it can be a differentiator. There's a lot of large institutional investors that are still going to look at DEI, ESG initiatives and are still going to weigh those heavily in terms of where they invest their dollars. So we're certainly not recommending clients, back off of disclosures around ESG and DEI initiatives. I'm just not sure you're going to have as many companies volunteering what they're doing if it's not a pivotal part of their kind of organizational strategy, let's call it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Ryan. I would say if anything, if companies are changing their disclosure, it's more maybe trying to remove some of the controversial buzzwords like DE and I, but still maintaining it within their programs, but just try not to have those kind of buzzwords out in their disclosures.
Okay. The third question, are you seeing hybrid approaches to board refreshment being adopted? For example, if you recruit a young director having a maximum term, and I'll just offer a comment, one of the companies whose board I serve on does not have an age limit, but they do have a term limit, and it is a 12-year term limit. So you can, if you join when you're 60, you can stay till you're 72. If you join when you're 50, you can stay till you're 62. And that, I think, it's a really good approach. But I'm curious, and this questioner is curious, whether you are seeing any of that kind of either hybrid, combining age and term, or any other novel approaches to board refreshment?
100%. Well, it's a great question. I think you're certainly seeing it. I have clients that have a term limit as well as a mandatory retirement age, meaning if I bring in younger directors that are unlikely to get to the retirement age before hitting the term. So yes, I think hybrid models, and I actually think you're going to see more hybrid models popping up as the initiative to recruit younger directors that are more savvy in things like AI, cybersecurity. You're going to have kind of that dual-pronged type of approach to ensure that your younger directors aren't able to sit on, a board for 30 years. And quite frankly, proxy advisory firms, institutional investors do not like to see terms that exceed, 10 to 12 years, quite frankly, because it just, how much are you still considered, quote unquote, an independent after you've been on the board for, 12 years, so to speak. I saw Mary just popped on.
Yep. All right, guys. You know that's the sign. So if you can get to the next slide, please. I just want to remind everybody that this webinar, I just heard that the PDF of the slides is not available quite yet in the resources, but it will be available in your post-event email. I also understand that maybe a link wasn't quite working in the resource PDF, so we will also send that to you in the post-event email. So keep an eye out for that. That's an important email because it also has our evaluation. So don't forget to fill that out. This is the first in the series for the year of the Compensation Committee webinars that we're doing together with Pearl Meyer. We will be having another webinar coming up on April 22nd. So keep an eye out for that on the nacdonline.org/webinars page. If you want to view this webinar or any of our previous webinars, both with Pearl Meyer or any of the ones that we do with NACD, you could always keep an eye on our archive webinars on that page as well. As I mentioned before, this will be available on that page as well as the pearlmeyer.com page. All right, so that concludes the program. Have a wonderful afternoon and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.